everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today to our session, Defending Sexual Identity Development and Challenging Sexualized Myths About Youth of Color. We're so happy to have you here with us. Today, you are attending our fourth part of a 12-part chapter of the month series based off of Henning's book, Rage of Innocence: How America Criminalizes Black Youth. So far, we've delved into the first 3 chapters of the book to discuss the overall criminalization of Black and Latino youth, focusing on the juvenile legal system, along with ways that youth defenders can combat the impact of racism on the lives of these young people. Now, our conversations have covered the basics of adolescence and how American society criminalizes young people of color so that they are not able to reap the benefits of that process. During our second time meeting, we talked about the importance of recreation, leisure, and play, and how for young people and how Black youth are criminalized for engaging in these activities. In our last conversation, we focused on chapter 3, hoodies, hood wraps, and hip hop. Therein, we talked about the importance of culture as the moments that happen when young people are engaging in recreation, leisure, and play, and how America criminalizes Black and Latino youth for their expression of culture. Today, we're going to move on to a related subject that is central to adolescent development, and that is sexuality, adolescent sexuality. Our discussion will flow from chapter 4, Raising Roots and Jezebels, and encompass the consequences of the over-sexualization and criminalization of Black children. We have 3 wonderful guests today for this conversation that we're going to have, and I'm going to introduce them. The first one is Brittany Mobley. Brittany is the Juvenile Services Program Deputy Chief within the Community Defender Division of the Public Defender Service. She first joined the Juvenile Services Program for PDS in 2015 as a staff attorney. Prior to PDS, Brittany was a senior attorney at the Children's Law Center within the Guardian Ad Litem program, representing children in the family regulation system for about 4 years. Brittany joined the Children's Law Center immediately after graduating from the Howard University School of Law, HU. While at Howard Law, she worked as a student attorney in the Criminal Justice Clinic, representing adults in misdemeanor cases, and also as a law clerk for PDS in both the Juvenile Services Program and the former Community Reentry Program. Currently, Brittany sits on the Protection and Advocacy for Individuals with Mental Illness Advisory Board, is the vice chair of the Juvenile Justice Committee of the American Bar Association, and is an advisory board member for the Mid-Atlantic region of the Gault Center, and is also a founding member and the national secretary of the Black Public Defender Association. She's also a proud 2021 ambassador for racial justice. Next, we have the famous Professor Henning, who is the director of the Juvenile Justice Clinic and Initiative at Georgetown Law. She was previously the lead attorney for the juvenile unit at PDS. Chris worked closely with the MacArthur Foundation to develop the Juvenile Training Immersion Program, now called the Youth Defense Advocacy Program. Her practice, training, and advocacy focus on racial justice in the juvenile justice system, and she has published numerous articles and essays on race, adolescence, and policing in journals and books, including Policing the Black Man. She is co-editor of an anthology, Race, Rights, and Freedom, 50 Years of Child Advocacy in the Juvenile Justice System, and, of course, the author of Rage of Innocence. Last but definitely not least is Maheen Kaleem. She is a human rights lawyer who has dedicated her life to creating a world where girls of color are safe and free. She is the vice president of programs and operations at Grantmakers for Girls of Color, a philanthropic organization dedicated to amplifying and mobilizing resources to support transformative organizing work led by girls and gender expansive youth of color. She has nearly 20 years of experience supporting youth and families impacted by interpersonal and state violence to lead efforts to advance racial and gender justice. Maheen has always grounded her work in the wisdom of women and girls of color who have survived the carceral system, sexual exploitation, and abuse. Maheen has led philanthropic initiatives to invest in strategies that dismantle conditions that lead to the disproportionate exploitation of women and girls of color. She's also advocated for the successful passage of numerous laws and policies at the federal, state, and local levels, and co-authored numerous reports, including The Sexual Abuse to Prison Pipeline, A Girl's Story, and Beyond Walls, a look at girls in DC's juvenile justice system. She holds a bachelor's and law degrees from Georgetown. She was an Equal Justice Works Fellow and was also an alum of the National Juvenile Youth Justice Leadership Institute. Those are our wonderful, very decorated guests. And we just want to jump right in with this discussion. Before I start, I just want to say that if you have questions, please feel free to use the question and answer function at the bottom of your screen. The chat is also open for you to express any ideas that you may have, or just thoughts or considerations. So let's go ahead and jump in. So Chris, we're going to start with you. So as we usually do, we want to ask you to set the stage for this conversation. I want to ask you to give us some background on adolescence and sexuality and tell us about the role that sexuality plays in the development of young people.
Yes, truly the most important thing to remember is that sexuality is a normal, healthy, and necessary part of adolescent development. It really is a critical piece of our overall identity development, who we are, how we fit into society. And there is a social, emotional, and biological component to our sexual development. Biologically, it's all about understanding how our physical body is changing in sexually relevant ways. Socially and emotionally, it's about forming intimate relationships with others, right? And it involves experimentation and exploration, whether that be looking at sexually explicit movies or images, about potentially texting, or as we call it, sexting friends with suggestive photographs or other suggestive messages. It's about fantasizing, about kissing the popular kid in school. And ultimately, data shows that in the year 2018, approximately 49% of young people have had sexual intercourse by the 12th grade, right? And the reason why I say all of that is to say it is completely normal. It is a normal part of adolescent development, of course, as long as it is consensual. And nothing about what I have described is criminal or deviant. And so that's a really important foundation I think we should have for a conversation like this.
Great. Right. So in the book, Chris, you talk about what you just said, and you lay that out beautifully. And then you go on within that particular chapter to talk about what I perceive as two different realities, one for white youth and one for Black youth and other youth who are historically oppressed. Can you just talk about the differences between how young people experience their growth into their sexual selves because of the way that society impacts them?
Yeah, absolutely. Race matters, to put it, bluntly. Race matters in what we are willing to tolerate, encourage, and support among young people. So for the most part, we give white youth, and particularly white boys, the freedom to experiment. And we give them the benefit of the doubt when it comes to mistakes, maybe, that they have made associated with sex and sexuality. And in particular, white boys enjoy an extended period of adolescence, especially as it relates to their sexual development. And this sort of extended periods of adolescence really extends well into their mid-20s. It includes socializing impacts, engaging in excessive drinking, watching pornography, and then demonstrating their masculinity through the sexual activity and sexual prowess, often which involves, but not always, often involves mistreating women in ways that are sexually inappropriate. But even that is allowed and tolerated. I mean, we all know, I'm sure we'll get back to this notion of boys will be boys. For white boys, sex is really treated as a rite of passage. And boys are expected to prove their manhood, right? Particularly in college or in their late teens and this sort of early adulthood, which has been called sort of this emerging adulthood period. But society seems to condone it. For Black boys, it is completely the opposite, right? They're treated like sexual deviants. Black girls are demonized, interestingly enough, in ways that they dress, as we talked about a bit, we touched on last month. They're treated as if they're fast and inappropriate if they want to experiment. Black boys are treated presumptively as if they are predators. They are not at all given them the benefit of the doubt. And so the stereotypes associated with Black sexuality not only criminalize Black children, but they also really leave Black children confused, if you will, about what normal, healthy sexual development looks like. And I often think about Black male athletes, right, who grow up in that college community where this, sexual prowess and this manhood is on, heightened activity, and yet, Black male athletes run the risk of sort of getting caught up in that sexually permissive narrative, only to realize that they don't have those freedoms at all. And so I know, before this is over, we'll talk about responses and to all of this, and how do we respond and advocate for a cultural shift, both for all children, really, for white children and Black children and other ethnic groups, which we should cover as well.
Absolutely. So Chris, I think that what might be helpful for everybody listening is to go back to the historical roots of this thing. And so like in the book, you refer to brutes and Jezebels, and like brutes referring to Black boys and Black men, and Jezebels, Black girls and Black women. And like most so there is this history that goes back to enslavement. So I think it would just be helpful for people to understand how these things grow from something and how it's interwoven throughout our system. So can you maybe give us some background on that?
Absolutely. I think the racial through line for all of this is critical. These racial disparities in our responses to sexuality, racialized differences in our response to sexuality did not grow out of whole cloth. So the term brutes is a dehumanizing stereotype. I think most of us know this, though, that portrays Black boys as monstrous, animalistic, sexually deviant, and a danger to white women and girls in particular. The Jezebel stereotype portrays Black women and girls as immoral, erotic, sexually promiscuous, seductive, and sexually available, right? And unworthy, this is really critical, unworthy of protections and unworthy of the assumptions of purity that are typically associated with white girls, right? And then you ask about this historical through line. Both of these stereotypes can be connected back to slavery, or to the period of enslavement. And the Jezebel myth, for example, served a social, economic, and political purpose, right? To justify the oppression, abuse, control, and rape of Black women and girls, to produce more Black bodies to be sold in this era of slavery. And so these narratives are told to advance an agenda. but they stick, right? They live on in the American psyche. And so even as, and this is really important, as we think about the first juvenile courts opening its doors, right? These are these benevolent institutions designed to save and rehabilitate troubled and neglected children. And even the progressive child savers did not view Black girls as morally worthy of those rehabilitative efforts, right? Black girls were beyond redemption, and Black boys similarly were treated as, demonic, and and even after, or as sexually evil, if you will, even after the Civil War and through the Jim Crow eras, when there is this resentment of Black freedom and the demands for civil rights, again, distorting Black sexuality became a really powerful tool to justify lynching, to induce fear, and to put, Black Americans in their place. And so, again, Black men in particular were depicted as lewd, sexually insatiable, and a particular threat to white women. We all know The Birth of a Nation, 1915 film, very much putting forth this narrative. And so now, in the wake of all of that, history is full of examples of Black Black Americans, Black boys, but especially Black adolescent males, right? Being accused of sexually violence. I think it is no coincidence that so many of those high profile examples involve adolescents. You wanna intervene and put Black children, you demonize Black children before they grow up and assert their independence and assert their rights. And so the way to keep them in place is very early on in adolescence, to demonize them. So growing out of that, you've got the Scottsboro Boys in 1931, you've got Emmett Till, being accused in 1955. You've got other children like James Hanover Thompson out of North Carolina, folks that we don't know about, George Stinney, being executed for allegedly raping. So the point here is these narratives started in very intentional ways, but they live on today in our cognitive repertoire, our thinking, our fears. So even, folks who are well-intentioned and committed to racial equity still fear Black children in sexually problematic ways.
Horrible, horrible. Thank you, Chris. So before we dig into the rest of the conversation, like really getting into the nitty gritty of some things, I just want to turn to Maheen and Brittany and just invite you that if you have heard of a similar dynamic for other groups of children other than Black children who experience this same type of sexualization in this a negative way, to invite you to share that, because we want to make sure that we are inclusive of everyone, of all children who are experiencing this.
I'll say briefly, one of the things that seems to come out there when we're talking about our brown boys, right, our Latinx youth, sometimes there's this stereotype of the Rico Suave character, right? So we see sometimes, and we hear this stereotype often when we talk to our Latinx clients, as to this idea when boys are together, it's automatically this over-sexualized thing. And they also are deemed and viewed as often very aggressive. Sexually aggressive as well. So it is something that touches all, kids of color. I will say I work in DC. The bulk of kids in the city that are going through the juvenile court system, the juvenile legal system, are predominantly Black boys. The other small percentage are brown boys. And we don't see white children in our court system. I know in the book, Chris has talked about the very solid number of white clients that she remembers having. But So in my direct experience, I will say kind of the two categories of racial groups that we see in our city, the same negative and harmful stereotypes about their sexual prowess, if it's even appropriate to say, because we're talking about children and teenagers, it is very similar, but I think also in uniquely different ways.
Yeah, thank you, Brittany. I would just add, I mean, for sure, I think I would just double click into what Chris said about the Jezebel myth being not only a justification for violence and exploitation of Black girls, but also an increased visibility. So I think about visibility, right? And how girls' sexuality, particularly Black and other girls of color sexuality, is hyper visible because of those legacies of enslavement and colonization. So for Latina girls, for example, they're either invisible in our systems, we don't collect data, as y'all know, and also when they are, the trope is really about them being hyper-sexualized, about them being spicy, about them being hot-tempered, and that is really rooted in sexualized tropes about Latina women, which again, were about a justification for the commodification and exploitation of bodies. Same thing with Asian women and girls. We see it all the time of both them being always foreign, for example, but also submissive and easily coerced as a way to, again, justify that is a behavior that is cultural, and that is just what they do. And in the juvenile system, I used to work in the Bay Area, we saw it a lot with Southeast Asian girls, Cambodian girls who were being sexually exploited through the sex trade as children, but were also finding themselves in juvenile halls because of those same tropes about a lack of regard for their being deserving of protection. And then I would just double click into Native girls who are not only disproportionately impacted by sex trafficking and commercial sexual exploitation and sexual violence, which again goes back to legacies of colonization that are really rooted in Native women and girls being either needed to be, as Chris said, those communities needing to be exterminated literally because cultures were not considered to be appropriate. It was used as a justification to both remove them from their families and put them into boarding schools, but also enact sexual violence. And those things continue today. And so there's no accident that Native girls are also disproportionately involved in the juvenile and criminal legal systems, and also disproportionately impacted by sexual violence because of a long legacy of a justification of access to bodies, which is really at the root of this. And as Chris said, those tropes that lead both into a lack of regard for their protection, or a view that we as a community and a society and our systems are not responsible for their protection, but also a hypervisibility around their sexuality and their sexual identity, even when they are children.
Can I just,
of course you can, go ahead.
Sorry, I was just, in some, all of the wonderful things Maheen just said are brilliant. And it also just leads back to the same notion as to, right, we're talking about how society and how the systems, the court systems view our clients, and how, you know, these players and actors in these carceral systems view our kids of color. But because of this same long history and this legacy of white supremacy and colonization, it becomes embedded, and it becomes also, we see with our young people that they themselves start to wonder and think, is this who I am? Right? Like that white supremacy, that colonization, you know, as we're talking about, has impacted kids of color. It does not need a white voice to say it, right? Like you know, folks of color, the young people themselves can be acting as a proxy because of these harms that have woven themselves so intimately into the fabric of exactly what we're talking about. And that's one of the things that's also just so incredibly heartbreaking to see in this work, and to see our young people themselves feel that this is the box that they are put in, and not see opportunities for themselves to be outside of that stereotype. Thank
you, Brittany, for that. And when we get get to the discussion about Jeremiah Harvey, which I really want to touch on today. I would love to come back to that, like, because I completely agree with that, and just like the way that these children are having to adapt to the world outside of the normal process of adolescence. I think it's key. I also want to pick up on what Maheen was talking about when it comes to girls of color and like essentially the objectification of them. And so I want to talk about a story that is in Chris's book, and she recounts one of her clients, and it's a young girl whose name is Mia. She was 16 years old, and Chris writes about, and so this is one of Chris's clients, and she writes about how police found Mia hiding in a closet of a abandoned apartment. The police suspected that she had helped her boyfriend break into a neighboring apartment, and so they took her to the station and they started to interrogate her. And Chris really just lays out how the way that this adult male police officer played on all of the things that we talked about in order to further victimize her. And so like Chris writes about how he really started to talk to her in a aggressive way, like from one end of the spectrum, being aggressive and like threatening, to like talking to her in a way that suggests that she should be physically disciplined. But then on the other end of the spectrum, really weirdly and grossly being like coming on to her and flirting with her. And so one of the things that he says is that you're so lucky that you're not my daughter, because where I grew up, guess what you be getting now? You be getting a belt. And then he goes on to, talk about how he wouldn't want to find her dead and raped somewhere or pimped out. And he's using all these different, things to try to get her to snitch on her boyfriend. But this is the part that really got me. Throughout the interview, the detective preyed on Mia's vulnerabilities as a young girl. At times, he employed the very techniques that pimps use to groom girls into sex trafficking. Flattery, promises of protection, etc. The detective said to her, "You're a pretty girl. You're tall. Let's say you're a pretty young lady. If I were your age, I would date you. Seriously, but you're running around with the wrong crew." The implication was clear. If Mia wasn't running around with the Black boys she was with, she could date someone like the detective. Now, it's important to note that the detective said all this to her to try to get her to, cooperate, and he would give her leniency. He did not do that. The prosecutor did not, give her any type of leniency. And come to find out, Mia actually had a history of sexual abuse. And when her legal team told the prosecutor that, the prosecutor did not care and told Chris and her team to call Child Protective Services. So I say all that to say this. What strikes me about this story about Mia and what Maheen was saying is that these girls, it's not even that they're not treated like teenagers. They're treated like women, but also like women who aren't entitled to compassion and care, and so like, it's not just a removal of adolescence, it's a removal of humanity, right? And so I just wanted to ask Maheen and Brittany if you had any further thoughts about this aspect of just like negating who these children are in their existence.
Yeah, I think what you said, Ebony, about specifically that Black girls and other girls of color are not entitled to the humanity and protection. And so when we don't just say like a failure to protect, it's actually a refusal to protect, right?
Mm-hmm.
That their victimization is at best expected. So that's like another thing, is that people are not fazed when they hear that a Black girl who comes into juvenile court has a history of sexual abuse, because of course they do, right? And so then the assumption is that this is just a fact of life. And as Brittany said, young people are internalizing that already. And because they don't show up in the ways that white womanhood and victimhood look, right? So like, I've had social workers tell me, well, she doesn't want help. She doesn't want to actually deal with her trauma. She's doing all these things instead of actually thinking like, well, what did we do? And where are the many, many, many ways that we failed this child before they ever ended up in front of us, as we don't, and as Chris's entire book is about, like, we don't afford Black children and other young people of color that, but then we also see that there's an active criminalization of all of the behaviors that are a result of that trauma, right? So like Jyoti Nanda Professor Nanda writes about how all actors at all stages of the criminal legal process actually enforce tropes about girlhood. And when young people, whether it's girls or non-binary young people, trans young people, actually show up and their presentation of what we believe a lady is supposed to look like is really rooted in white girlhood and white womanhood, if they go against that assumption or our idea of what gendered presentation is supposed to look like, our response is to place them in the system. And so we see that over and over and over again. And I think it really hits on on Mia, right? That Mia was not presenting in ways, and that officer, I read that as like, the officer knew what Mia had internalized. So I really double click into what Brittany had said. I've worked with so many young people who have been trafficked who've said, this is who I am, and actually use the terms that other people use about women and girls in the sex trade about themselves and said, this is what I'm always going to be. This is what I'm born into. And when systems respond that way, it just reinforces that in a way that then she goes into survival mode, and she's having to negotiate all of those things that she has to negotiate in school, on the streets, with this officer who has an inordinate amount of power and control over her.
Yeah, and in thinking through how, and thinking specifically about Mia's case and how else we see it show up in other circumstances we see it show up, it's interesting because there are times where, you know, this is a police officer allegedly here to serve and protect, and has completely further victimized and caused harm. And I know referring to our kids sometimes as victims, particularly girls who have had sexual trauma, is tough, but I'm saying it very deliberately because he has now created so much harm for this young person, and is in a role where he's supposed to be helpful. And other system players, and including defense attorneys, right? We have to be able to use judgment as a mirror and reflect on what we do as well. We look in this space and further buy into that harm by also not showing kids compassion, not showing our clients compassion, right? And rather than address and acknowledge and name the harm that has befallen them, instead we work on fixing, right? So telling girls, you shouldn't act this way. This is how you're going to be viewed if you do this. You want to dress in a respectable way. I remember there were, we worked with a young person who the agency viewed her as probably, being involved in some sort of sexual exploitation or and it wasn't even the fact that she was a survivor of trauma. It was, she was putting herself out there in the sex trade as a teenage child, right? Like, this was a teenager, somebody under 18, because of the way she dressed. And then the conversation shifted to, oh, well, you shouldn't always dress like this. A teenager in the summertime, I don't care, you're, black, white, what color you are. Teenage girls right now are wearing shorts and crop tops and, and it's the norm. But instead, the focus was on what she was doing wrong by, dressing in that way, and was given no compassion, and instead was being, tried to be brought further into the system just because of something as simple as that. I mean, it really shows up in so many different ways. And I'm going to name Black girls specifically because the over-sexualization of Black girls is just palpable. As a Black woman now who went through Black girlhood, I remember it then. I see it show up in my clients now. I see it and feel it with my clients and have to deal with that secondary trauma. And it's, yeah, I don't even know other word to describe it other than it's heartbreaking and absolutely disgusting that we do that to girls of color, particularly Black girls, and give them no semblance of innocence and care.
Yeah, and just like as a Black girl, so I, like you, Brittany, remember what Black girlhood was like, and it was hella confusing, right? And we're going to talk about it a little bit more when we get to Jeremiah, but I'll just say it's a process of your brain not being nearly fully developed, but having to navigate a whole bunch of societal pitfalls, excuse me, that kids just should not have to deal with, and the consequences extend into adulthood, as we both know. Chris, I want to turn to you and talk about boys. And so can you share with us some examples of Black and white youth who are accused of sexually related offenses, but they get different results? Can you just talk to us about some of those instances that you know about?
Yeah, I mean, I'll just, highlight a couple that I talk about in the book. One of the more famous stories that I bet you everyone remembers on this Zoom is, the differential treatment between Brock Turner and Marcus Dixon. And I should pause and say, everybody knows Brock Turner. Some folks don't remember Marcus Dixon, but Brock Turner is the, white Stanford student who was convicted of raping an unconscious classmate and was sentenced to 6 months in jail. And he served 3 of those months, and then was followed by a period of probation. And the ways in which society felt like even that was too much, this notion of him having this promising life ahead of him, and to think about the possibility of any jail time for him, as his own father put it, it's 20 minutes of action out of his 20 plus years of life, and that he shouldn't be penalized for that. So it's this sense of entitlement, is a word I know we have used, a sense of extraordinary permissiveness of white adolescents that we've been talking about, but then contrast that to Marcus Dixon, right? 18-year-old football star with a 3.96 GPA in his high school. He's in a high school. This is Marcus Dixon, y'all remember, from Georgia, was adopted by white parents, and he attended a school that was 94% white. He had a football scholarship to Vanderbilt and was on his way to this wonderful, promising career until he was charged with rape, right? And it was his 15-year-old white classmate accused him of forcing her to have sex in a trailer. And he insisted that it was consensual, and that the girl was lying because she was afraid of her father. Ultimately, the jury in that case agreed that it was consensual, quite unlike Brock Turner's situation, right? But agreed that it was consensual, but convicted him nonetheless based on a statutory rape and aggravated child molestation offenses. And that was because Georgia made it illegal for anyone illegal for anyone to have sex with a minor under the age of 16. He was sentenced to 10 years in prison, right, for a consensual sexual act. And this is significant when we think about the contrast between Marcus Dixon and Brock Turner. Folks should know that ultimately a sort of a wealthy appellate attorney stepped in about a year after Marcus was convicted and serving his sentence, and won an appeal on his behalf, and he got out. But he became a real sort of a poster child in changing some of the statutory language in Georgia. But that's one critical contrast. Another critical example is, folks won't remember this one, but there was 17-year-old LaVar Allen who was charged with sexting. In other words, possession of child pornography in contributing to the delinquency of a minor after exchanging nude photographs with his 16-year-old white female friend. She actually sent him nude photos. He sent her some in return, and it was consensual between two teenagers, yet it was her parents this time who called the police, and he was arrested, right? The girl, the 16-year-old girl, was never charged. These are some examples of the ways in which we see those contrasts for boys. There really is a double standard. And we certainly should talk about, Jeremiah Harvey in more details, not so much set up as a contrast, right? But it's really important for us to talk about that.
Cool. Thank you, Chris. And so I want to also come back to something you said earlier about boys will be boys, right? And I think that at this point in the conversation, I think that we can agree that the phrase really should be white boys will be boys. And so like you've written about several examples of how white boys are given the benefit of the doubt when they make these mistakes. And there was a particular case that you wrote about that was in New Jersey that was decided by Judge James Trano. Can you tell us about that case and just talk to us about your thoughts about what the judge did?
Yeah, and it's fascinating because we pull these cases out like sort of as examples, and we use them in symbolic ways, and I think this is one of those cases, right? And I only give that caveat to say that there are certainly nuances, but here's the deal. This is a 2018 case from New Jersey. 16-year-old white boy filmed himself having sexual intercourse with an intoxicated 16-year-old girl, right? And he sent his friends that a video with a text that says, when your first time having sex was rape. Absolutely appalling, right? The judge declined the prosecutor's request to transfer that child to adult court and dismissed the text messages as just a 16-year-old kid saying stupid crap to his friends, right? You know what's really powerful is the fact that I can't tell you, Ebony, what that child's name is, the 16-year-old boy. Why? Because it wasn't in the newspapers, right? Whereas a Black child routinely accused of sexual assault from the outset, before the case is even, thoroughly examined and prosecutors are allowed to make a decision about it, are transferred up to adult court where it becomes public record, right? But those are the basic facts, right? And the the judge went on to reprimand. So not only did he decide not to prosecute or to grant the request to transfer the child to adult court, but he then reprimanded the prosecutors for not telling the girl and her family that pressing charges against the 16-year-old male would destroy his life. Right. And that he was destined for a good college. He had great test scores. He was an Eagle Scout. He was came from a good family. And, there were other problems that, go beyond race. I mean, the judge went on to suggest that this wasn't rape at all and that rape could only happen between strangers. Interestingly enough, quite unlike the response in Georgia. But the appellate court overturn that. And it really gained a great deal of publicity, both because of the judge's sort of attitude about women and girls and the way in which this girl was treated, but it also really garnered a lot of attention and conversation about race, right? And the racial differences and the absolute, you talk about boys will be boys, this permissiveness that is granted to white boys. And, I really want to say that my concern about the case is not that this judge was willing to treat this child as an adolescent and to look at the mitigating factors. This is exactly what we as a defense bar want judges to do, to not only look at the severity of the nature of the offense, to consider the victim, the harm to the victim, to consider the impact of sexual violence on girls, but to also simultaneously consider the promising future of all defendants, right? The mitigating effects of adolescence as a whole and the rehabilitative potential of all children. Unfortunately, though, our country's long history of bias and these tropes and these stereotypes that we've been talking about really does prevent judges, prosecutors, probation officers from seeing Black children in the same way that the 16-year-old boy was seen, Brock Turner was seen, and the like. But to really just to close in on your boys will be boys point, I really want to remind folks that boys will be boys originated as a Latin proverb. It was children are children and do childish things. That was where it came from. And so the original proverb was really quite benign, but the phrase has now morphed into this catch-all phrase that is used to excuse and to trivialize misbehavior of males, really, at all stages of development through their words and attitudes and sexually aggressive behaviors. And so it is now, though, and let's be clear, the phrase garnered national attention again when Brett Kavanaugh was nominated to the Supreme Court. And what that phrase has exposed to us and is leading in part to this conversation we're having today is America's willingness to excuse sexual behavior and to grant a leniency and a permissiveness to sexual behavior by wealthy, elite, educated white boys, right? And none of this is granted to Black boys. So boys will be boys is indeed white boys will be white boys, and that's the phrase.
Thank you, Chris. And I just want to also thank you for highlighting the point that you made about the New Jersey judge not being upset that he chose to recognize this young person's potential and adolescence, because I'm sure that there are plenty of people who would listen to our conversation and say, well, what do you want? I mean, do you just want to let them all go? Like, that people who commit sexual assault should be punished. And I just love your point that children are different. We know that their culpability is different. The way that you hold them accountable is different. The treatment and services that you give them is different. What we're saying is that the way that you treat white children in terms of giving them that benefit of the doubt, in terms of giving them that care, needs to be afforded to all children, particularly Black and brown kids. So thank you for that point. Mm-hmm. Brittany and Maheen, so I did want to just hit on how the sexualized tropes of girls are color are harmful to them in contrast to the assumptions made about white girls. And I was getting at the innocence versus non-innocence thing. We've talked about it a little bit already, but I just want to open it up again in case you have other thoughts.
Yeah, there are two things that kind of come to mind. One of them is, we know that Black girls are disproportionately criminalized for being survivors of child sexual abuse, of sexual violence, of sexual exploitation, that when Black girls are experiencing child sex trafficking and other forms of sexual abuse, they are more likely to be pushed into the criminal and juvenile legal systems, even if they are considered to be victims or survivors, the response is a criminal legal system. And so I think it goes back to what's the response? And I think about this incident. My friend's daughter in DC experienced a boy so both Black children in DC in school, in an elementary school, where a boy slapped her behind. And immediately the girl was removed from the classroom. And my friend was so upset that what message are we sending to her that when somebody is trying to enact harm against her, and then I said, well, what do you want to happen? And she said, I want someone to sit those kids down and explain to them what appropriate behavior is. I don't want that little boy to be removed from the classroom either. But because there are school resource officers in the classroom, the response to a Black child is to immediately involve a system, instead of saying these are children that actually just need space to learn how to engage safely with one another. And so I think about that a lot in the context of girls. I also think about, again, even when girls are considered to be victims, we see that Black girls and other girls of color are more likely to be held or detained pending a trial where they are the testifying victim witness. I have literally experienced girls being handcuffed and held in the same area that defendants are held, even when they're being brought to testify against a trafficker. Again, because there is still an element of criminality that is attached to her as a Black girl that is not attached, or there is an element of criminality. I mean, I think we have to bring in tropes about Black motherhood and whether her mother has the capacity to protect her. And that is used as a justification to remove Black girls from the community, even when we say, okay, we recognize that they're disproportionately impacted by child sex trafficking, for example, but we also see that they are disproportionately removed from the home, placed in residential placements. And so again, and that goes to tropes about her mother and her other caregivers and their capacity to teach those morals. That so it goes back to what Chris was saying about assumptions about Black womanhood and morality that is really rooted in a justification for the criminalization. And we see this with immigrant communities of all kinds, where we're making assumptions about communities' capacity to provide the morality or presentation of girlhood that is really rooted in, again, like white girlhood.
Whiteness. Absolutely.
Maheen is preaching today. It is, I mean, and Maheen, you're wonderful and you're so brilliant. And it's so, so, so true. This notion as to who defines morality, that Black families aren't able to instill appropriate values into their children. And it is better than to remove a Black girl from her home and her community and send her far away under this guise of protection, right? But if she is somebody who we're worried about is overly sexualized and potentially being sexually violated or harmed, why then is she the one that has to leave, right? Why is she being sent away under this notion of protection? Because she needs to learn, right, from somebody else, some institution, some quite likely predominantly white institution, as to what are appropriate behaviors, how to behave and act in your own community and society, away from what's your reality and what your family is, rather than pouring into family and supporting community and turning to community to support and look to how we're going to support these young folks. It is really just disgusting, the level of the amount of times that we see young girls who get sent away from home when we know that they are themselves victims or survivors of harm. And again, it's under this notion that it's protecting them, but what we're doing, and we've seen it historically, the harms of this, right? So it's just continuing this cycle of pushing girls out of their homes, out of their communities, out of spaces where they're able to learn and explore and better understand and educate themselves as to how to manage these types of relationships and be safe.
Yeah. I think you're both preaching like quite a bit. And I'm not going to add anything to those two beautiful points. I want to move into a next section. We've mentioned Jeremiah Harvey a couple of times here. And I want to just cue up a clip. And so as we get that clip ready to go, I'll just say that Jeremiah Harvey was a 9-year-old boy who was at a grocery store in Flatbush. And a woman accused him of touching her butt. And so we're going to play this clip. It's about 4 minutes long. And then the panel and I are going to engage after that.
It's still hard because I have this lately on my mind. Like I can't think nothing more but this.
The little boy at the center of the viral video dubbed Cornerstone Carolyn is now sharing just how deeply this moment has impacted him.
I just was sexually assaulted by a child.
9-year-old Jeremiah Harvey was in a Brooklyn convenience store with his mother and little sister last week when Teresa Klein accused him of sexual assault.
That's right, the son grabbed my.
She then called police.
Did you have any idea why the woman said she was going to call the police?
A review of surveillance video proved that Jeremiah had not assaulted the woman. His backpack accidentally grazed her.
I felt humiliated.
She falsely accused you of something.
I'm gonna stay right here. I'm gonna stay right here.
Jeremiah says that night he cried out of fear that he or his mother would be taken away by police.
Are you concerned that this has permanently scarred Jeremiah?
Yes, I certainly am. It was devastating for him because even after walking away, he was pointing to, patrol cars on Flatbush Avenue and saying, "Mommy, are they here to take you away from us?"
And now, more than a week later, Jeremiah still visibly traumatized by the incident.
To be having a conversation with your son about sexual assault at the age of 9, I never thought I would be having this conversation with my son at all.
A little while ago, while Mom was talking, you started tearing up. Can you tell us why?
I started to tear up. She had to sit down, explain to me while I was going to bed.
That fear that was placed in your heart, Jeremiah, is going to be placed with something great. You're going to be an example for other children, Jeremiah. Do you hear me?
As for Klein, after watching the surveillance video, she did issue an apology to Jeremiah.
Young man, I don't know your name, but I'm sorry.
I accept her apology. I want unity. I don't want no harm brought to this lady.
Do you accept her apology?
Yes. Yes, I do. Friendship is the key.
Hey, Mom, how are you feeling right now?
I know that this is going to take some time. It's going to take a lot of healing.
Certainly will. Jeremiah initially said that he did not forgive Teresa Klein. As you can see from our conversation, he has since had a change of heart. He and his mother are hoping that this is going to be a lesson for people, that people are going to learn to be kinder and more accepting. But Jeremiah still has a lot of healing to do. You know, before this was always...
Thank you, Amy. So the thing about the Jeremiah Harvey story is that I have an 8-year-old. I swear to God, if I cry during this thing, all right, I'm gonna put it together. I have an 8-year-old. I have an 8-year-old son. And the thought of having to explain to my son what is sexual assault, if he knew that people did that to each other, that would just like devastate him. Like, he would be beyond devastated to know that that was a possibility, that that thing existed. But then to have somebody accuse him of doing that to somebody, the trauma he would endure. So like, that's how I know that the emotions that were on Jeremiah Harvey's face are like beyond real and far reaching. And when his mom said this is going to be a really long time before he can deal, like, I know she is absolutely right. And what it brings me to thinking about is how the reality is that, like, my son Jackson, I probably should be talking to him about this now. And we'll talk about that sex talk in a minute. But like, he is most certainly getting bigger, and he is at the age where, like, I definitely should start having this conversation with him. And it's going to be, I'm going to watch the light drain from his eyes. Like, I'm going to watch his innocence just drop down. And what it's like for Black children and Latino children and other kids to have to walk through life like that. And it was like that for me, right? Of having to enter, well, in Jeremiah's case, he hadn't even entered into adolescence yet, but preparing to enter into adolescence with all of the crazy things that happen during that time with your social groups, with your body, with the way that society even deals with like gender norms and all that stuff. And then layer on top of that race. And you've then created this scenario where these children have to navigate grown-ass people in their lives. And so coming from the girl's perspective and thinking back to Brittany, what you were saying earlier about Black girlhood, I want to ask Maheen to talk about how, so like in Chris's book, she writes about how girls who enter puberty, they have to deal with society's response to that, and how, like I said, when race is layered over it. Can you talk about how systems overlay sexuality onto girls of color that impact the way that they develop?
Yeah, our president and CEO, Dr. Monique Morris, wrote a book called Push Out, The Criminalization of Black Girls in Schools. And she talks a lot about Brittany, you talked about this, but dress. And I saw some conversations in the chat, right? That like when you're hitting puberty and your body is changing, there's a mix of things happening. You don't know what's going on. You don't like what's going on. You don't know how clothes fit. And yet you see Black girls being chastised, punished, suspended, arrested, literally for either clothes looking just different because girls of color are hitting puberty in different ways. Their bodies form and develop in different ways. People are used to seeing clothes look, I mean, if we're talking about structural things, we're talking about fashion too, right? Like how clothes are made to fit certain bodies versus other bodies. And when that presentation is different, our systems hold them culpable for other people's response to them, as opposed to considering how we are culpable. So I remember going to this like training on preventing teen pregnancy in DC like many years ago. And there was a little boy who talked about how at his school, he caught the principal looking at one of his female classmates. And he got in trouble because he said something to the principal. And so I think like he was hyper aware and feeling very protective of her in that moment. But he was also criminalized on top of her being suspended for being told that her shorts were too short. And that was the thing with, and he kind of said, the principal said something about her shorts, and he said to the principal, well, why are you looking at her shorts? Like, why are you looking at her behind in that way? Why are you looking at her body? So we see girls, Black girls in particular, but other girls of color being criminalized for their dress because of how their bodies are developing. But then also as Brittany and Chris writes about, and Brittany talked about, they're called fast. They're held responsible for other people. So if people have actually engaged in sexual abuse or exploitation, if they've experimented or are presenting in ways that people don't feel are appropriate, going back to Chris's point that young people experiment with sexuality, the response is, she's fast, she's inappropriate, we need to control her. And so systems respond with control. They respond with, this is how you should be dressing. I mean, I've literally seen probation officers put dress codes in the probation requirements as though it is the business of the court what a young person wears, right? And this is not even speaking about the policing of Black hairstyles and how Black girls are pushing, Chris writes about this, of course, that hairstyles that only and predominantly Black girls are wearing happen to be the hairstyles that young people, that dress codes are literally written to push young people out, right? So it's again reminding, and I think when we think about like the girl, I always go back to like, what is the message we're sending to that child, right? We're sending her a message that school is not a place for you, that you are not welcome here. Like I think about the girls at Spring Valley High who were told like, this is actually not a place for you. Your voice, your activism, your safety, your vulnerability have no place here. And then we expect, so then they go to court, right? Maybe they have a history of trauma, and then we expect them to tell us their history of trauma, as though they are supposed to expect that a system is going to respond to them with empathy and kindness and compassion, when literally absolutely no system has done that. And all of the messages they're seeing in the public view are that Black people, Black girls, Black women are responsible for the violence, exploitation, and dehumanization that is done to you, and not worthy of any element of just being able to just be you and experiment in the same ways that other young people do. And we see it, I mean, we see it with Black girls, and we see it with other girls of color whose bodies develop differently, and again, don't comport to people's kind of the public imagination around girlhood.
Brittany, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, Ebony, I appreciate you being vulnerable and acknowledging what that must feel like, having an 8-year-old son and watching that video. I have a 9-year-old nephew, and I mean, right now on my refrigerator, we've got pictures of pretend monsters he's drawn, right? Like, he's worried about dinosaurs and monsters. Like, that's his mind. And I can't imagine a kid that age having to have those conversations. But also, and I am going to get to Maheen's.
No, you're fine. Take your time. You're good.
After just seeing that video, it really feels like a gut punch every time hearing that story. But I remember, now my nephew is now 9. I remember when my nephew was about, I want to say 6 or 7, having just a little conversation with him about consent. And it happened in just, which I think is important, right? Like, we should talk to kids about consent, and that's helpful and normalized. We should normalize that. But it was done in a silly way, right? This is when my dog was alive, and he wanted to, hug and pat my dog. We're like, well, ask for his permission, right? Like, that's called consent. Like, if you want to. So he sat there and said, my dog's name is Brooklyn. Brooklyn, may I give you a kiss on the head? And you know what I mean? But, and just also remembering in that moment, having a conversation with my sister, and her saying, like, it is important for us to start thinking about this now, because he is a little Black boy, right? Like, consent, someone's going to look at him a lot differently. So he's got to definitely start learning even earlier. And this is when he was around 6 or 7. Now at 9 years old, he's worried about dinosaurs still, right? Like that. And we were like having to have that thought process for our kids, for Black children, little Black boys, and Black girls, right? Like, what all of this means. It really is just something that is just, I don't think we'll ever find a space to fully heal from that harm and from that trauma. But in thinking about, in talking about development and puberty, Chris at the very top of this talked about, really normalize things, right? Like, kids are going to explore their bodies. They are curious. They're going through puberty. Their bodies are experiencing different things. They may look at pornography, right? And I have seen more often that I would like, adults who themselves have gone through some sort of development as they've gotten older, almost forget that that's a normative thing. Or I'm going to scroll back up in the chat, because I remember, Maheen, you used the language, was it purposeful or something, right? Like ignoring or something, but purposefully ignoring the fact that this is normal behavior, and instead vilifying young people because of it. I've had clients who really have, governmental actors have considered sex offender therapy because kid was watching porn. I'm like, are you serious? Is that a conversation we really have to be having? Because this Black child, a Black teenage boy, you caught him watching porn, and now you're worried what it may mean. And now we need to explore this. We don't know where this is going. And me having to say, you're doing the thing. You're starting this process of labeling this child a sexual deviant for something that is completely normal. And of course he's going to be looking at pornography. Of course she will look at pornography. Of course they'll look at pornography, because that is something that children do, and as they're exploring and learning about themselves. And then going back to another point, sorry, I'm all over the place, but there is so much great stuff here.
You're good.
In thinking about, we talked a little bit earlier, but I'm thinking about this again as we're talking about this kind of internalized process that our kids go through, are particularly our Black and brown girls. I've had multiple clients, and very recently, talk about sexual harm and sexual trauma that they have had, and they have said, no, but it was okay because I agreed to this part. So it was okay. And I agreed to this part. And the person who harmed them, were significantly older. So it's, and these were children who could not consent. But then I remember having those conversations as to, why are you excusing all of this away, right? Why are you, in essence, protecting other people and falling on the sword, right? Like, kids are seeing this and viewing themselves as the person creating the harm or doing the wrong thing, despite it being done to them. And for girls, and these are young girls I'm talking about, right? Like 12-year-old, 13-year-old clients that we've seen excusing away harm that has come from them. And they've even acknowledged, well, I did go over here. I did hang out with this person. I wasn't supposed to. And it's, themselves not even granting themselves grace to just be a child who explores and, does very normal things like wanting to go hang out with your peers or wanting to go, as we talked about earlier, with the popular kid in school and wanting to get them to like you. The system creates oppression in so many unique ways for kids, where they start to put those same shackles on themselves. So they don't have an opportunity to be free and really enjoy and engage into what it is to be a child and a teenager, a developing adolescent.
Yeah, I just two things really quickly. Like, one is manipulators and exploiters, like that police officer that was engaging with, know that the system will do that. And they actually rely on the system to do that. So I've had, there are so many young people that I know and traffickers that I've met who are like, well, I know that, all they're going to do if you tell them what happened to you is arrest you. They're not going to believe you. They're going to take you away from your family. And so your best bet is to just be out here in the streets with me, because good luck getting any protection over there, whereas I'm offering you some here. So it's not just that, it's that there are people that are ready to exploit, that they know the system is going to respond to them in that way. And then the other thing, I just want to bring it back to Jeremiah is, Brittany, when you were saying that they are excusing behavior, he is expected to forgive.
Right.
Like, that burden he is being weighed, like, I mean, I don't have to tell you all, but like, that Black children learn very early on that people will expect you to forgive the harm, the violence, whether structural, whether that horrific dehumanization that he experienced on national television. What choice does that 9-year-old baby have but to say, because what would have happened if he had said, no, I do not forgive, right? That white woman for behaving in that way. He doesn't have that. And even whether he knows it or not, there is somewhere in his subconscious that he knew that he wouldn't have the opportunity to actually feel what he might have really been feeling in that moment.
And then fact that I'm sure, there's a wing of people now who will celebrate and say, oh, how good of him to be able to forgive. And again, completely detracting from the point that he had no reason to forgive this woman, right? Like, she did not deserve his forgiveness. She was not owed his forgiveness. If that was his choice, if that was his mother's choice to choose forgiveness, God bless him. But that was not owed to this person, this woman who on video said the ridiculous line of, I was just sexually assaulted by a child. That sentence alone is the most asinine thing I have heard. And this child and his mother, bless this amazing, wonderful Black mother who is having to go through and, teach her son patience, continue to uplift him, and have to manage and wipe this child's tears when this woman, called the police and created all of this for him. And now they, are choosing forgiveness, and we're going to applaud that, right? Like, they shouldn't have to forgive. they shouldn't be in a situation where they have to ask forgiveness. Black children, Black people should not be in positions where they are having to forgive people who have taken away their innocence, who have taken away and caused harm on them. But it's what it's expected. It's what's anticipated. It's what we know to do and to give and say, it's okay.
For racism as a whole, right? Like that's a whole other panel, right? Like about like how Black people are definitely taught to turn the other cheek, like, you know, these, yes, like completely agreed. For what it's worth, when it was, so like what the clip didn't show is that it was like a week later when Teresa Klein found out that he didn't actually touch her butt, and like the way it went down was the owner of the store showed the video footage that showed what actually happened, and like the entire neighborhood came out to watch it. And when it was shown that like he didn't actually touch her butt, they gave her feedback, to put it mildly. So staying on Jeremiah, Chris, I want to turn to you because it's fairly easy to dismiss Teresa Klein as like a wackadoodle, or like even like a straight up like racist, right? Like she's just like this far outreaching racist. But what I found a part of the book in this chapter where you talked about subconscious bias and how a person could get to the point that she got based off of their life experiences and the way that race has played out through our society. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, I mean, there were so many things, and I just want to say thank you. It's almost emotional sitting there listening to, you know, Maheen, Brittany, and you talk about, you know, how this plays out for Jeremiah. But one of the things that I was especially struck by in watching the story the first time unfold, and then even in this conversation, is exactly where you're going, which is that people are outraged now. You look back on this now, and people are outraged. How dare she? How could she think that? Let's be clear. This could have been anybody, right? Any woman walking through, and many of us, even if we're honest with ourselves on this call, right? And it's really about precisely how subconscious bias works in our country in particular. I mean, let's think about how this plays out. Teresa Klein is standing at a cash register. She felt something behind her. She did not see what it was. And so she is left to draw conclusions without all of the facts. She is left to create meaning out of the little bit of information that she has. So what does she do? She turns around, and the reality is, had she seen a girl or had she seen a woman of any race, the chances are that she would not have assumed that there was a sexual touching, right? If she had seen a white boy, especially a white boy at the age of 9 years old, right? It is unlikely that she would have assumed that the child's touching was sexual, because we don't think about 9-year-olds in that way. But Jeremiah was both Black and male. And after 50 years of exposure to sexualized stereotypes about Black males, age has no relevance anymore, right? You no longer get that benefit of being the 9-year-old, no mitigation of being the 9-year-old who could not possibly be, you know, a sexual predator. So that goes to all the things that we've been talking about, you know, since we started the series about the adultification, you know, of Black boys, the adultification of Black girls. You turned around, she doesn't even see him as a child, even though she uses that term, right? I got assaulted by a child, but it's only, she could even conceive of a child doing that precisely because he is a Black child. And so I just think this is such a powerful testament to how bias works, and how all of us, right? Even folks who are, you know, quote unquote, everybody wants to use woke and, you know, alert and attentive to,
alert,
attentive, racially conscious. And someone put in the chat, actually, right? You know, someone put in the chat that, even defenders, right? We work with young folks and we forget that we have become complicit and have bought in some ways to some of these narratives about Black children, and particularly in this instance about Black boys. So, there's so many things to be struck by. I just, I don't want to go too far back. I just, this notion of this forgiveness piece of the conversation is such a powerful one. And it made me think of the rage of innocence. And if anybody's ever heard me talk about what the title is about, it is precisely that. It's about the rage that we should all have when we fail to treat any child like a child. But one of the more nuanced pieces of that title, it is the rage that Black children have when they are told over and over again that they are dangerous, that they are sexual demons, that they should be excluded, all of those things. And so this notion of forcing a child, or expecting societal expectations that a child, who is, still evolving, impulsive, reactive, fairness fanatics, emotional, should suppress all of that and be graceful and forgiving. Yes, that's what we want. And it's really extraordinarily difficult as a Black parent, Ebony, for all the reasons that we've talked about, to navigate that extraordinarily tiny tightrope between trying to prepare your child for these inevitable moments of discrimination, inevitable moments of labeling, while at the same time not over preparing them such that they are afraid, right? And unable to function and engage safely in society.
Yeah, no, Chris, like you are, like calling it a tightrope is exactly right? Like, there's like a fine line between, instilling like pride and, like wanting your child to have opportunities and to live freely, but then wanting to keep them safe, and then going too far to the other side, which could make them paranoid individuals. And then at the underlining of it all is the reality that you don't have control over any of it anyway.
That's right.
Frankly, like you don't actually have control over what happens. And that's one of the hardest things as a human being who loves children, who has affection for any child. That is what is one of the hardest things to deal with. Like, I mean, like I've said to, like when the story about Jeremiah Harvey came out, I said to myself, I was her mama, if I was his mother, I would have whooped her up and down that sidewalk. Right. Joking, of course. But the reality is that, like, no, I wouldn't have, because I would have went to jail.
That's right.
I would have gone to jail.
Yeah. And you know what, Ebony, the other thing that struck me, every time I watch this is remember, and I was wondering if we were going to play that part of the clip. What is he crying about? He is crying because he is terrified that his mother is going to get locked up. That is all a part of the trauma, that racialized trauma that Black children experience in our country, related to policing and the ways in which police have engaged with Black and brown communities. So that to me is, so not only is he learning that lesson about, the sex talk and what, the risks are to being a Black male with a sexual identity, which he didn't even have at the age of 9, by the way. Right. But, he's got to reckon with that and reckon with policing. And what does that mean for him as a Black child who could lose his mother or anyone else? And so that's the other reason, Ebony, you wouldn't have done it, because you aren't going to be snatched up. You aren't going to do anything that gets you snatched up in front of your kids. So
yeah, that's the only reason, frankly, that I wouldn't have done it, if I'm being honest with y'all. Like, that's the only reason why I wouldn't have done it. So, okay, listen, y'all, like we've had this really robust discussion about this, and I really want to turn to strategies to combat this and to fight it. We have a lot of youth defenders who are on the line today. We have a lot of other advocates who are on the line who I'm sure are fired up, really pissed off, sad, and what we need to do now is to fill them back up with action. So I want to start with Maheen first. Maheen, you've written on reforms for girls of color who are in various systems. And so can you just talk to us about some of the reforms that you have seen be successful and some of the reforms that you're embarking on now?
Yeah, I would say, well, the first one is, a couple of years ago, and we're still here. Kim Crenshaw said, we haven't even cared about Black girls enough to count them. There is still very, very little data collection. I think at the federal level now, there's, thanks to Dr. Monique Morris and Kim Crenshaw and other folks, there is advocacy to actually get disaggregated data. But like the first one is like, let's actually see what are the drivers that are pushing girls of color into systems. Black girls, Native girls who are disproportionately involved in both child welfare and juvenile and criminal legal systems, and also Latina youth who continue to be invisibilized in those systems. And then let's actually ask them the questions like, why are you here? What's going on? Because every community is going to have a different kind of set of data. And I think I certainly learned that in doing the report on DC, as opposed to looking at the national data. Different communities have different responses. In DC, they love to arrest girls for simple assault, right? So like, what is that about? What's going on in schools? What are the messages that are happening? And I also remember, I think this ties into the second one, which is listen to girls of color. Like they will tell you exactly what they need. They will tell you what's wrong. They will tell you what's wrong with your system. There was a really good example of that. At some point, DCPS did some listening with girls of color because there was all this fighting happening in schools. And girls said, well, you took away all of our recess. You took away all of the time that we had during the day to resolve our conflicts. So like, what opportunity do we actually have to work anything out except in the 15 minutes between the bell ringing and getting on the bus to go home? And so what young people have told us, what girls of color in particular have told us, is create more spaces. And this actually goes to all children, I think. Create more spaces in the community, in schools, for young people to learn how to deal with conflict and how to deal with harm and what that actually means. And particularly when we're talking about boys and girls of color, there is a lot of really powerful work being done to really talk about what healthy masculinities are and how they can deal with those so that they can learn to be safe with each other. Dr. Morris has a book that is a follow-up to Push Out called Sing a Rhythm, Dance a Blues, which is how schools and educators can think about schools as sites of healing and liberation for Black and brown girls. And so I would just invite us, like, what's the opposite side of that? How do we actually create both schools and communities to actually be places where young people experience healing and liberation? And so the second thing I would say is actually invest and think about and advocate for community-based resources. We see that oftentimes girls are being pushed into systems, whether it's child welfare or it's juvenile legal systems, because the claim is there are not enough resources in communities. I know as a funder that there are a lot of resources led by folks of color in communities that get no money and no resources. And so I think that if we actually looked at those as viable alternatives to incarceration and strengthen the infrastructure of those entities and practices and strategies, we would actually, when you go into court and advocate for a child and they're saying, well, what's the alternative to sending her to residential placement? Well, there's 5 other programs in the community. And so I think the other very concrete thing is figure out what resources exist in your community, particularly for girls of color. And it's hard because there isn't a ton of infrastructure around it, but you can find them. If you need help finding them, I can help you find them. But I think we fund in all 50 states at Grantmakers for girls of color. That tells you that there are programs serving and often led by women of color for girls of color in all 50 states, Guam and Puerto Rico. And so I think I would just say think about and do the research to figure out what those resources are, even if they don't hit you in the face. And I think as a responsible defender of young people, it is important to actually know what those resources are. And then the third one I would point to is, there are a number of jurisdictions that have really committed to ending girls' incarceration and brought together multi-system stakeholders to collect the data, what's driving girls into the system, how can we strengthen system response, how can we really look at what we are doing to address things, how can we create interventions early on, and how can we wrap communities and families with support and really build that infrastructure around young people. And so, Vera Institute for Justice has a whole sort of ending girls incarceration program, which partners with community-based organizations and also with jurisdictions. I would point to Santa Clara County as one of the places that they've worked. They've done some work in New York City. They've done some work in other places. There's a long way to go, but I would say that, and then I would say actually that if we can actually interrogate, oh, it's possible to end girls' incarceration because the numbers are so low, those interventions can actually work for all young people, because they prove that actually there are ways outside of the juvenile legal system to deal with what young people are dealing with. And so my last kind of offering would be, always ask, is the system the appropriate response? And if it's not, how do you figure out what the appropriate response is and offer that? If I learned anything from Professor Chris Henning, it was, if you come to court with another alternative and they don't have anything else, you are much more likely to get people to buy into it. It might mean a little extra legwork on your part, but it actually will mean that that child gets to stay in the community and the family gets the supports that they need to keep that child safe.
That is 1,000% true, Maheen. Like, the juvenile justice system is not supposed to be the place where children are getting treatment and services, right? And so, like, I was in Chris's clinic, and that is absolutely true, absolutely true. Brittany, so I want to ask you to give us some thoughts from the perspective of a youth defender. So what guidance would you give for youth defenders when they're interacting with their clients and they need to be thinking about contending with and pushing back on their own biases about stereotypes and tropes that are related to kids' sexuality?
I think it's something that we have to keep on the front of our mind as defenders. And one of the things that I think some defenders struggle with, we have to first acknowledge our own biases, right? Even though we are on, we like to think, right, we're on the right side of this system, we still are system actors, right? But for this young person being in front of the court, or but for them having contact with this carceral system, our jobs wouldn't exist. I would love not to have this job, right? But we're still here. We still are human beings, and we are still exposed to the world. So we are impacted by our own implicit biases. So we have to name that, I think, is step one. We have to name it, accept it, and be prepared to reckon with it, right? Like, we can't shy away from that, because that's only further creating harm and perpetuating these narratives and tropes against our clients. So I think that's step one, really having to take that on and name it and acknowledge our role in it as well. And part of that, if you're having trouble with acknowledging it, Chris regularly shares, she trains all over the world, talks to folks, and reminds them, you can take the implicit association test, right? Like, you can Google it, it's there. If you're unsure, take as many tests, there's different kinds as you want, but to just show and prove to yourself that there is some bias that exists. And we have to name it and think about it on the front end, right? One of the things that I have a really great team that I work with, and I regularly ask them to call me in, right? I think creating space with other defenders and other peers and, colleagues to hold each other accountable, right? So if you're thinking of your case in a certain way, right? If you're talking about a client in a certain way, before you even get that case, before anything, right? Meet with your colleagues, go to people that you feel safe with, your supervisors. I asked my supervisor this, I asked the attorneys that I supervise, call me in, right? Like, check me. Am I saying, what are my words saying? What am I, how is this coming across as I'm thinking and talking through this case? And be willing to accept that feedback and that pushback when someone says, wait a minute, what did you just call your client? Or why do you think your client needs sex offender treatment just because they are talking about girls in a normal, healthy, appropriate way? So be willing to, kind of create a team of folks who are willing to support you as you continue to work against these biases that we do have. And I think also, most importantly, we like to think we're really smart people. Yeah, we went to law school. That's great. That's wonderful. The person who knows the most about their life and about themselves is the person living it, right? And that means talking to our clients, hearing our clients, asking our clients how they're feeling in this moment, what they think about this, right? With also an understanding that we've had these what we talked about earlier. A lot of this does come to a point where it is internalized. So reminding your clients and, uplifting them to experience and be willing, to allow themselves to experience childhood, right? So understanding all of that and really kind of balancing all of these things, I think really is going to be helpful moving forward. Also continuing to educate yourselves, attending webinars and sessions like this, we're never too smart to stop learning. I think taking space to read the fabulous book, The Rage of Innocence, gives us a lot of good space to reflect. And I think also it's really helpful. Sometimes I like to do is go back and take a minute to look back on past cases, right? Because then it's easier, right? Hindsight's always 20/20. If you had a case that maybe, closed, it's nice to just go back and kind of comb through it and see what would you have done differently? Were there moments, that you missed, opportunities where you could have advocated in front of the court or your fact finder, other, parties, for your clients and educating them as to the racial stereotypes, the racial biases that they had against your client. So, just kind of keeping your mind sharp and constantly working at it, I think is just necessary. It's something that, quite frankly, if we're not doing it, I'd argue, it's malpractice, right? In order to do our work well and effectively and for our clients, and we've got to continue thinking about all of these things.
Thank you, Brittany. And so I want to ask you a related question. So those are great tips about dealing with internal bias. Can you give some insight into how youth defenders can deal with other court stakeholders when they, abide by those sexual tropes and stereotypes, and how to call people out without hurting your client? Like, this is a similar conversation that we have about raising race, right? Like, how do you raise race without creating negative consequences for your client? Can you just give us some thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I regularly ask Chris that same question with some part, right? Like in brainstorming, trying to get some of that. One thing I will say, I'll give an example as to, a situation where it came up. It was actually at an event several years ago where Monique Morris, Dr. Morris, was talking about her book, and there was somebody there who supervised one of my clients, and he asked a question to Dr. Morris, and it was very clear from the question he asked is which client he was talking about, and he was very clearly sexualizing this girl, and it was just so strange to me why he would ask this while Dr. Monique Morris is talking about the book Push Out. It was just really inappropriate. So she handled it very well and really checked him and put him in his place and let him know about himself. But it created an interesting opportunity for me afterwards, right? To now say, hey, we've had this opportunity to experience this, this brilliant woman talk about these things. Why is this happening? There's not always going to be those situations where you're coincidentally in rooms with Monique Morris, calling out and doing the legwork for you. But I think some of the things that a lot of us deal with is really being more afraid to call it out and being more fearful of the potential harm rather than, taking that chance and doing so, right? And I think that I have found, I will say that just naming it and talking about race regularly, then they know to expect it from me, right? Like they know I'm going to talk about the fact that the system is racist, I think, and that our clients are experiencing harm, and that Black girls specifically, we have Black female clients, because we know the statistics show that often they have experienced sexual harm and sexual trauma, that I'm going to be talking about that and not wanting to further cause harm on Black girls. So that's something that I think, if it's always at the tip of your tongue, it's going to be less surprising for folks and maybe less offensive for folks. But I also understand there is the reality that, I know folks from various jurisdictions, right? I'm in a jurisdiction where there's predominantly Black folks, and there's a lot of Black folks in the system, police officers, probation officers, and judges. And it's so sometimes it's a little easier, but I think the nuance I am continue to try and work through is also identifying with folks of color, that we also can perpetuate harm on Black kids and kids that look like us. So I feel like that's a kind of non-answer with also a very direct punt to, I would turn to Chris Henning, because I'm sure she's got other ideas too.
And on that note, Kristin, do you have thoughts?
Yeah, you know what? I decided, you two brilliant women, Brittany and Maheen, really offering your insights feeds directly into some of the things that I was thinking about, particularly, from the litigation space, right? What do we do as individual litigators, defenders in individual cases? And so I can pick up right where, Brittany left off, which is indeed, I look back on Mia's case in a couple of different ways, right? And I think about what could I have done, right? And one of the things that I wish I had done, we did call to the attention of the prosecutor that we asked her specifically, you need to watch the interrogation video of Mia with this in mind. But what I did not do was to provide her with research on the Jezebel stereotypes and all of the literature that we have today, right, on the ways in which girls are, really, she was being pimped out, like really by this officer. And so I wish I had offered more of that. So I think, to build upon Brittany's point, one of the things that I sort of identified as a takeaway was in the same way that we are now starting to incorporate implicit racial bias research in our pleadings, in our motions. We also need to be explicitly incorporating the research about sexualized tropes, of course, as appropriate in our cases. So in the motions, in oral arguments, in negotiation with prosecutors, absolutely naming it and putting it in a written pleading and not being afraid of it. I think the other thing is also hiring, again, in appropriate cases, expert witnesses to come and talk about normative sexual development, right? Including ways in which sexting is normal, including ways in which, experimenting with consensual sex across racial lines, by the way, is wholly normalized. Or wholly normal and a part of healthy adolescent development, all forms of experimentation that are not meant to be predatory at all. I also think that we should think about whether or not we can do an equal protection or selective prosecution claims for disparate prosecution and disparate sentencing of Black and Brown youth for sexual offenses. And of course, we know it is hard to bring an equal protection claim. It's hard, one, to get that record of those cases that weren't prosecuted. And it's hard to show like malicious intent in the selective prosecution and equal protection space. But what it does do is it jumpstarts the conversation, right? It allows us to highlight some of those anecdotal cases that we know. I have to tell you, right here in the District of Columbia, there are private schools in which I know from parents at those schools that there have been allegations of rape, but yet you never see those in DC Superior Court. You do not see those cases. Right. And so we have to ask ourselves why. And so it's like, maybe I don't have the raw data. I don't have the quantitative data, but I certainly have the qualitative evidence of those disparities in my local jurisdiction. So that's another suggestion. With regard to Mia, again, this notion of being more attentive as defense attorneys to the ways in which children, Black children, brown children, especially girls, okay, and even trans children, right? And I saw a really important comment about the ways in which we have to nuance this conversation for transgender children, but the ways in which children are sexualized, hyper-sexualized by police in non-sex assault cases. And that was what Mia's case is about. It had nothing to do with any type of sexual offense. And so what can I do as a defender? Well, we filed a motion to suppress her statements, to suppress that interrogation based upon that sexualized treatment, arguing that that was a part of why it was that she gave her statement, right? That was demonstrated how the statement was involuntary at the time. And then the last two things that I will say relate to something you all three of you talked about, which is the ways in which, and I think Maheen, you started it, is the system the appropriate place for this child? And then Ebony, you built upon it. It's not the place where children should go to get services and treatment. I want to add to that, it's also not the place where we need to send children to educate them about sexually healthy relationships at all. And so in preparation for this session, I really wanted to think about, well, what do we do? How do we say to the court? How do we say to other stakeholders that this isn't the place to educate them, and where do we send them? Well, one of the things, if you look for programs, there are actually programs out there on safe dating, right? Or safe relationships. And so there's one program that we found in particular that is given in empirical reviews and studies called Safe Dates. It's a 10-session dating abuse prevention program for middle and high school students, just meant to educate them. Simple as that, educate them on healthy outings, healthy relationships. That's what kids need. They don't need to be in the court system. If we're serious about, and a lot of this arises out of, like, I think about the Teresa Klein encounter with Jeremiah Harvey, rises out of the hashtag, out of hashtag Me Too, and out of legitimate concerns about domestic violence and abuse of women. All of that are legitimate concerns, but we have to be careful about how our biases distort that movement, right? A very important movement, but yet we distort it by targeting Black and brown children. And so thinking about if we want to decriminalize normal sexual adolescent behavior, and we're serious as a society about reducing sexual violence, then we've got to educate in other ways, and that's not through the legal system. And then finally, I was curious also about, we hold up multi-systemic therapy, family functional therapy, of a range of evidence-based best practices for serious violent offenders. And I was curious, so if there is in fact a serious violent offense by a young person, then what do we do for them? And when it is a real violent offense, there is also multi-systemic therapy with the sexual, a sexual component to it. MST, PBS, targeted specifically, or PSB, excuse me, targeted specifically towards problematic sexual behaviors. So I think that's the way I'll end, which is separating out what is normal adolescent behavior and getting that stuff out of the system. And then on the other hand, how do we respond in humane, rehabilitative, adolescent appropriate ways to even serious offenders? That's the theme, I think, throughout all of our conversations over the course of this year about the criminalization of Black and brown youth.
Beautiful, Chris, thank you. So we have time for some questions. And so we have one question from Earl Ross. And he says, can you say more about this point in regards to Black and brown parents' control to protect their children when confronted by these systems, and what it does to a child's sense of safety? So I'll open that to anyone on the panel who wants to address that.
Well, it's interesting. I mean, if I understand the question, I think it follows from Brittany, from Ebony, actually, what you were talking about, right? And this your feeling as a parent that it's out of your control. But you know what? The reality is so much is out of our control, right? Like, traffic accidents, plane, pandemic, all of that stuff. And all we as parents can do is scaffold them with the truth, the transparency. So, this notion of the sex talk, being real with them about what the risks are. This is, you're a child, and we know that you want to or will ultimately eventually experiment with with your sexual identity. Please come talk to me when you do, right? Opening that opportunity, opening that space and saying to the child, let me tell you what the risks are as you're making your decisions, as you're making your choices. And this is, I think, more for older teenagers, but I think about my cousins. It's so funny. Brittany talked about her nephew. You talked about your son. I mean, it's impossible to be a Black or brown person and not have these conversations. And me talking to my cousins about their nephews, about my nephews, their children, really critical on this question of who you can date in high school. Right. And being honest about interracial dating and what the risks are. I'm not saying that this is that there's anything wrong with it. In fact, I support you. You love who you love. But at the same time, you need to know what the realities are and then come up with a plan. As a family, come up with, what's the best that you can do? In terms of teaching your boys and your girls how to have healthy relationships with their partners that are open and honest, about the fears and the risk and the possibilities. I think it's the best you can do. I mean, that's, it's almost unsatisfactory, but it's the reality. Tell them.
Right. Yeah. And to the last part of the question about what it does to a child's sense of safety, that's the tightrope that we talked about, is that if you go in too hard and if you live in a constant state of fear, then you will produce a child that does not enjoy life and is not joyful. And that's like a nightmare that, you could have a child who would not enjoy their life. But at the same time, there is a more than healthy dose of caution that comes with being Black and brown in this country. So that's the last question that we have. Go ahead, Maheen, please.
Just gonna say, I think we see it with Black and brown immigrant young people as well, particularly because system involvement invokes a threat of deportation and other kinds of harms that can come to communities. And again, I think one of the things that we often see is young people can be very quickly parentified. And so I'm really glad that you brought up safety, because I see so many times where young people don't want to talk about the harm that they might be experiencing because of fear of how systems will impact themselves and their families. And so I would just underscore a lot of deep respect for parents who are navigating all of those things. And I think the other piece of that, though, is I've encountered a lot of defenders who might have all the compassion in the world for the child and zero compassion for the parent. And so I think we also, it is incumbent to recognize that trauma is intergenerational, that parents have their own trauma when their child gets system involved, that it is not just the child who is experiencing that trauma. It is the sibling, it is the parents, it is the siblings at home that they have to consider. And so I see it a lot, particularly with single mothers. And so I want to underscore, because we're talking to folks who are advocating for children and systems, that it's very important, not always an option, right? We know that sometimes young people can't live with their legal parent, their parent or guardian by birth, but to recognize that folks are navigating a lot of things, and some folks are, as you named, Ebony, doing the best they can. And so part of ensuring that that child has a safe, their safety and well-being is prioritized, is ensuring that that parent is also met with compassion and support.
Absolutely. So you guys, thank you for this wonderful, beautiful, heart-wrenching, but uplifting conversation. This has been amazing to talk with you three beautiful women with your perspectives and your work. To be connected with each of you is such a blessing and an honor. To our participants, I just want to say thank you so much for coming and for listening. About halfway through this webinar, I thought to myself, oh my goodness, we're really saying this stuff and people are listening, and how revolutionary is this, that we're saying all these things from our personal experiences and about the experiences of young people who often aren't heard or seen. And so I just wanted to thank everyone for coming, and then just also strongly encourage everybody who is here, who interacts with young people, particularly young people of color, to remember their humanity, to remember their adolescence, and to just fight like hell for their ability to just be children, to just be kids. Like, let's just all agree and pinky swear that what's the most valuable and important thing to us is that we will not allow this to continue going into the future. So thank you for being with us on this Tuesday afternoon. We will see you next month. Be easy.